homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me for this talk on corn and growing sweet corn. And I will preface this by saying I am definitely not an expert in growing sweet corn, but I've dabbled with it over the years, and I wanted to give you some information on what I've learned over the years and a lot of mistakes that I've made and a lot of things that I didn't understand. I don't know about you guys, but as a home gardener and somebody who's interested in kind of feeding my family the best food possible and living a little lighter on the planet, I tend to default towards heirloom varieties on most seeds because those heirloom varieties a lot of times have got all kinds of flavor that a conventional variety that was designed for storage life and shipping does not have. But it turns out that corn is the exception to that rule rather than the rule. There are three basic types of corn. There are flint corns, there are flower corns, and there are dent corns. And a dent corn is a cross between a flint and a flower corn. And it's called dent because when it's dried, the actual kernel has a dent in it. And that has to do with how much starch is available in that individual kernel. Flint corns tend to be used more for things like polenta. Popcorn is a type of flint corn, and a sweet corn is actually a type of flint corn as well. And then flour corns, they have a higher starch content, and they usually are ground into a soft corn flour that is used for all kinds of things. In terms of the way that evolved over time, the northeast part of the United States tended to default to one type of corn, I believe the flint types of corn, if I'm remembering correctly. And then the southwest part of the US and down into Mexico, those tended to be more of the flint types of corn. I will put it on the screen if I've got this wrong. I can't remember for 100% sure. And it had to do with how much moisture that plant needed. And so in the eastern part of the US, it rains a lot more. And so there was one variety that was way more adapted to drought conditions than another. And so they got selected over time for that reason. Sweet corn was a spontaneous genetic mutation that caused the sugar content in that corn to increase and the starch content to decrease. Basic sweet corns are 5 to 10% sugar compared to a typical flour or field corn that you might have seen. And so the first genetic mutation, and I have some notes here just because otherwise I'll get this wrong and won't remember it right. All of the genetics that I'm going to talk about here are recessive, and you may remember from long ago high school biology or maybe some college biology because we all had to suffer through Mendel about 1,000 times. Recessive genes are ones where you have to have 2 copies of the recessive gene in order for it to continue. Otherwise, the dominant gene will overrule it. And so in order to maintain a sweet corn variety, you have to make sure that it is not grown anywhere near a conventional flour corn or flint corn because they will easily cross and the dominant genes will win out. And so sweet corn was a spontaneous mutation, but it was a little bit hard to maintain. The original mutation was designated as lowercase su, and that was simply just called sweet corn. So that actually happened with the Native American tribes and was in existence, in the late 1400s, early 1500s. So that's been around for a really long time. Some of the original heirloom varieties of sweet corn that you can still buy seeds for today are things like Golden Bantam or Country Gentleman, Stowell's Evergreen, Silver Queen, which is one of the first varieties of corn, the sweet corn that I ever grew was Silver Queen, and then Fisher's Earliest, which is another variety that I also grew. And I think most of those I just looked are available on the Seed Savers Exchange website. So you can get your basic old-fashioned sweet corn still available, those heirloom variety seeds from Baker Creek, from Seed Savers Exchange, from some other locations. The issue with that is the old adage is if you're going to go pick your sweet corn, you need to have the water boiling on the stove when you pick it. Essentially, they're sweet on the stalk, and then as soon as you pick it, that sugar starts turning back into starch, and within 24 hours, it's been reduced by 50%. And so those original SU sweet corns don't hold well. The other thing that I found with growing those is I was new to growing sweet corn. I wasn't sure when to pick it. I wasn't sure when it was ready. It was all a little bit of a roll of the dice. And what I pretty quickly found out was if you wait too long to pick it, it gets really starchy really fast. And so I was picking it too late because I thought maybe it'll get bigger because that's what I do with every vegetable I grow because I pick it too late is I think maybe it'll get bigger and then it goes to seed, or it's past its prime because I waited too long because I'm always trying to maximize size. I don't know about you, anybody else relate? But sweet corn, the traditional old-fashioned sweet corns, if you pick them too late, they get really starchy and they're just terrible to eat. So you need to pick them exactly when they're ready, and that window of opportunity is usually pretty short. And then you need to have your water boiling immediately. And so you can't just pick it and then throw it in the fridge and it'll be great, 3 or 4 days later. So the second mutation that was discovered as scientists really started to dig into this in the 1950s was what was called a super sweet mutation. And that was designated as SH2. And that was 4 to 10 times sweeter than the traditional SU sweet corn. So quite a bit sweeter. They originally had a lower germination rate, and so that was one of the trade-offs, but they stored better as well. And so not only were they sweeter, but they tended to hold better both on the stalk and most importantly in the refrigerator. And so you could pick those and they would still be good in the fridge 4 to 10 days later. That's a huge improvement, especially if you're a small commercial grower. So you're selling at farmers markets, you're selling at a roadside stand. Having corn that is going to hold for a couple of days, massive improvement. Those didn't really take off until the 80s when people wanted to start being able to ship corn around the country. Vegetables in the grocery store typically come from 1,500 miles away at this point. And so in the 80s, when that really first started to happen and we were getting away from a lot of locally grown stuff, the SH2 varieties, the super sweet corns, really started to take off. And then from there was a third mutation that was discovered, and this one was designated as lowercase se, and that was called sugar enhanced. Sugar enhanced was 12 to 20% sugar, and then had a longer shelf life as well, and so retains its sweetness for longer and is easier to deal with. Varieties of that I've grown over the years include peaches and cream and ambrosia. And then from there, we started actually actively breeding some of these on purpose. And it wasn't just mutations that existed, but it was things that we were trying to specifically breed for. And so we now have synergistic corns, which are designated lowercase sy. Synergistics have some of the SE, and then 25% of it is the SH2, and so it's a combination of the two. One of the trade-offs with some of these is that they're a little bit less juicy, and so they were trying to get the best of all possible worlds, where it was maximizing sweetness but also maximizing juiciness, because having a sweet corn that's dry is not so great. So varieties of those that I've tried and grown are Cup of Joe, and then Providence, and I've had good success with Providence. I like that one quite a bit. And then lastly, there's now something called augmented SH2, and augmented SH2 is a combination of all 3 of those genetic mutations. And so it's got some SU, it's got some SE, and it's got some SH2. There's a whole bunch of different variations on this, but they all start out with the word extra, and it's spelled XTRA, and so extra tender, and then usually a number designation. So there's a whole bunch of those. And one of my local farmer friends here, he's known for his sweet corn, and I have bought corn from him for many, many years. I did farmers markets right next to him for many years, and he grows an extra tender variety. I can never remember the specific number, but that is his go-to sweet corn, and that's what he buys. And that one I know specifically because I would just buy 12 ears from him and throw them in my fridge. And honestly, I've eaten that corn when it's been in my fridge for a couple of weeks, and it's still really delicious. So incredible storage on that. So that's your basic things you need to know about sweet corn in terms of what seed you should purchase. And honestly, I do not recommend the old-fashioned heirloom varieties, the original SU varieties, stuff like the Golden Bantam. I don't have that ability to know exactly when to pick it and to immediately cook it. And then really you need to stagger the plantings, because otherwise you're going to have an entire row of sweet corn that is ready to go, and you need to eat some of it and then freeze or can the rest of it, because it is not going to hold. That's way too much pressure for me. I need something that's going to give me a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit of window of opportunity. And so I much prefer the different other varieties. This year I'm trying out one that's called Nirvana, that's a super sweet from Johnny's. We'll see how that goes. But I don't recommend the original heirloom varieties. It's one of the rare instances when I actually think that the hybrid varieties are better. Keep in mind, GMO, genetically modified corn, is very well known. and a lot of people are worried about it. You cannot purchase genetically modified sweet corn over the counter. So you are not, as a retail customer and consumer in the United States, you are not going to accidentally buy genetically modified sweet corn. It is not available. If you're a large commercial grower, you can buy it, and there is some sweet corn that is Roundup ready and all of that stuff. But as a regular retail consumer, you do not have to worry about accidentally buying it. However, it's not unusual for varieties to have some cross-contamination because corn is a wind-pollinated plant and it can pollinate for up to 2 miles away. And the part that we're eating is actually the seed, which is the part that is the next generation. And so a lot of times you can actually see that genetic cross in the corn cob itself, especially if you're growing a white variety of corn and you've got field corn around you that's yellow. You will actually see those yellow kernels in that white ear of corn where individual kernels were pollinated by some field corn that was in the area around you, which is actually it's an interesting thing because a lot of times you can just visually inspect and pick out, if you're saving seed, the ones that are crossed. I learned a lot of this information from Carol DeP when it comes to corn and genetics and crossing and flower corns and flint corns. And I have another video on some of that information that I'll put a link to below if you're interested in trying to grow your own flower corns or your own popcorns or your own polenta corns. But this is a video specifically on sweet corn, and so I won't go heavily into that. Other things to know about corn: it's a hungry crop. It takes a lot of energy to grow, sometimes 6-foot stalks of corn. It's a grass. It's in the grass family. It's just interesting we don't usually think about eating grasses, but the reality is most of the grains that we eat are actually grasses. So corn is a type of grass. It's a hungry crop, and it's also a very thirsty crop. So it needs quite a bit of irrigation. I will look up and put on the screen what the recommended amount of irrigation is per week for corn. I live in the Western United States where it does not rain. Most of the Western US is less than 20 inches of rainfall a year, and we do not get rain in the summertime here. And so the idea of planting anything and just waiting for the rain to fall is a non-starter. So I have to irrigate everything. And so I irrigate with a drip tape irrigation, and I deeply water about every 3 days. But I do use a lot of compost in my corn crop so that that corn has a lot of nutrition in the soil. In terms of insects and pests, we don't have a ton of issue around here. We don't have a lot of humidity, and that helps a lot. So the only real issue that we have is something called corn earworm, and they're relatively harmless if you can get over the ick factor. They will lay eggs in the top of the corn cob as it's starting to mature. The egg hatches and you get a corn worm in there. They're usually right at the top of the cob and they're yucky. But what you do is you peel that cob, you break that part off, and you just toss it to the chickens, and then the rest of that cob is perfectly fine and good to eat. They rarely get past about the first inch. There are some things that you can do to combat corn earworm that are good organic control methods. I have read mineral oil. I've never tried that because I just don't like the idea of mineral oil on my crops. But Bacillus thuringiensis, so BT, the same stuff that you use for cabbage lopers, so the cabbage larvae that eat all of your brassica crops, that also works on corn. And you need to spray it as the corn is starting to tassel. So the top part of that corn is where the pollen is. And then the actual individual corn cobs is where the female part of the plant is. And that pollen from the male is going to fall down onto those silks on the cobs and actually pollinate. That's how pollination works with corn. When those corn start to drop pollen, that's about the time you want to start spraying with Bacillus thuringiensis. Usually each stalk of corn will only have 2 ears of corn on it, which was a surprise to me when I first started growing corn. Somehow I'd never really thought about it, that for this huge plant, you're really only getting 2 ears of corn off of each individual stalk, and in some cases only 1. So that's part of why corn is such a heavy feeder, because it's such a big plant, but the actual amount of edible food that you're getting out of it is surprisingly small. I usually go through and spray the BT mixture directly on the individual forming ears. So when I see those silks, I'll spray those silks. And if you go through and do that a couple of times once the pollen falls before your crop is ready, that will usually cut down on your corn earworms drastically. And that has worked successfully for me. It is a little bit expensive, but if you're selling corn, you want to sell at a farmer's market or at a roadside stand, or you you just totally icked out by insects in your food, Bacillus thuringiensis works for corn earworm. So that's what I would recommend there. There's days to maturity that are on the package of the corn. I have found that those are usually pretty much right on the money. And so if you are looking at the, 70 days to maturity, 80 days to maturity from the day you put the seed in the ground, that's usually pretty darn close. And so if you're trying to figure out if you have enough time or a big enough window to grow corn in your area, look at your days to maturity, because it is actually very helpful and accurate. The other thing is, if you want to grow multiple varieties of corn, sometimes you can stagger them, where you have one that is a 70-day to maturity and another that's 100-day to maturity, and you can plant them a couple of weeks apart. And so basically when one is dropping pollen, the other is not even remotely ready yet. And then when that other one is dropping pollen, the first one is already finished and is not going to get it. So you can actually plant multiple varieties if you have a time difference between when they're going to be dropping their pollen. And so that can make a big difference if you're trying to grow, some flour corn and also some popcorn, or some flour corn and some sweet corn, and you're worried about them cross-pollinating. Just stagger them in time rather than in distance, and that can save you. The other thing to know about corn is it really needs warm soil. So basically, if your soil is too cold and too wet, that seed will not germinate, or it will just rot in the soil from too much moisture. And so it can be tricky if you're in a cooler season climate, or if you're in a short growing season, to be able to pull off corn in the window of time that you have. It's usually direct seeded. You can start it in individual cells and plant it out later, and that can be successful, but it's really time consuming, particularly because you need quite a bit of corn in order to have a big enough, dense enough block for it to adequately pollinate. And so starting that many seeds in little individual cells and planting them out can be a huge time suck. The other thing about corn and growing corn that a lot of new gardeners don't realize is you need to plant quite a bit of it. It is wind pollinated, as I mentioned, and it needs to be planted in blocks or rows where it's bunched together, so that when that pollen starts to fall, it will actually have a good chance of falling onto the right spot in order to pollinate and start growing your actual ears of corn. And so if you just have a little backyard garden plot and you want to grow corn in a 4x4 foot bed, your chances of getting good pollination in a little plot that's that tiny are fairly small. And so a lot of times when people have a hard time growing corn, that's the problem, is they're just simply not growing enough of it, which can be a problem for a small backyard garden, which means support your local farm stand, support your local farmer's market. Corn is usually fairly inexpensive when it's in season. Just go buy it from your local farmers and can it and freeze it and eat it till your heart's content, and don't worry about trying to grow it in your own backyard. But it does take quite a bit of space. What I do is I plant a 100-foot row, but I have 3 rows right next to each other, and they're about 8 inches apart. So in the space of 2 feet, I have 3 rows of corn that are pretty tight, pollinated. And you'll see that in the cob, where you'll have mostly undeveloped kernels, and then there'll be a few that got pollinated, and so you'll have a few kernels in there that are nice and plump and juicy, and then everything else is kind of flat. That's an indication that you did not get adequate pollination. But this method works pretty well for me. So that's what I've learned about growing sweet corn. And the main message I have for you is this is one of those rare instances where not buying the heirloom is actually the preferred thing to do. So I will keep you posted on how our corn crop is doing this year in our garden tours. And then I'll probably do a video in August when my corn is actually ready, showing some of that harvest and talking a little bit about how do you know when your corn is actually ripe. And in my experience, it really is just one of those things that comes with time. I can, at this point, feel the ear and just feel how big around it is and know whether it's ready or whether it's not ready. But that is something that has come with harvesting hundreds of ears of corn over the last many years. And so that does make a big difference in terms of knowing when it's ready or when it isn't. So what kind of sweet corn are you guys growing this year? What's your favorite variety for fresh eating and fresh picking? Let me know what your successes and failures have been with growing sweet corn in your backyard. Do you think it's worth it? Or do you just buy it from your local farm stand and don't try to do it in your own backyard? Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, Leave me a comment and share. I have new content coming out every week.